Hello everyone, welcome to the GeoEcologist. I am Dr. Krishnanand and you have been watching my videos on geography and several other topics related to environment and research methodology. In this series on models, theories and laws in human geography, today we are going to learn about one of the very interesting concept of the development that happened through ages, historical development that is also called model of economic growth given by Rostow. So this Rostow's model of economic growth came in 1960 and it talked about that how the development happened at a particular space or a particular economic space in terms of historicity. So it's basically historical model of growth that we say. Right? So it was divided into several phases, right from the primitive, the early phase to the postmodern phase. Right? So let's understand that what is this historical concept of economic growth that is also known by the name of Rostovian take-off model. But before we go ahead, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and do share the videos with others as well. So now let's learn about this Rostow's model of economic growth. Rostow, that is Walt Whitman Rostow, was an American economist and he was a professor of political theory as well. He was not just an academician but also he was a national security advisor to the president of US, that is Lyndon Johnson, in 1966 to 1969. So he was a person of great importance for that matter if you observe in terms of academics and also as a political theorist. Now what does he have to say about economic growth of a particular place? So Rostow's stages of this model was important in terms of economic growth, which had the underlying principle of historicity, the historical model, the historical development that was the underlying principle. So in 1960, what was his theory? It was published in this volume of work called The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. By the name itself, you must see that it was talking about non-communism ways, right? It was not based on social development or communist development according to the Marx that we studied. Right? So this was kind of non-Marxist concept, non-Marxian theory. So stages of economic growth basically talking about the historical development, and its second name is also on his own name, that is Rostovian take-off model. So what is this take-off that we are going to learn? And it is one of the major historical models of economic growth that argues a particular thing, that is economic modernization happened through 5 basic steps or stages. Right? So this is again historical model, time-dependent model, that's important, and also evolutionary model. Right? So from traditional society, we have preconditions for takeoff, then he defined the takeoff, then drive to maturity in an economy, and finally the age of high mass consumption. Right? So this was the process that he emphasized that would happen in a given society. Right from the traditional or primitive society, how a society develops at the age of high mass consumption. What is this journey all about? What is this evolutionary process? That was important to understand in this model. So now let's elaborate and understand all these important points that he had to say. So first important step is the traditional society that he said. What is this traditional society? Where you have the primitive ways of living, the subsistence agriculture, almost no technology, lack of mobility. If you remember demographic transition model, initially in the first step, that was pre-developmental phase, what was there? It was birth rate and death rate which was high, and it was almost primitive agriculture, subsistent agriculture, right? That was present there, and no technology or almost lack of mobility was there. People were not that mobile. It means what? Lack of technological innovation, lack of transport development, isn't it? So primitive primary sector economy was there and the society was agrarian in nature. So what happened after that? In the second step, the society develops and their preconditions starts. Preconditions to take off. It's very similar to what you say that when you travel by a flight, what happens? Initially, you board the flight, you sit there static, stationary, then you are being carted off to the main line from where you will start fly. So this is the preconditions just before takeoff when you follow the instructions, right? So when a captain gives you instruction, this is preconditions to take off. To tie your seat belt, remain seated and straight before the takeoff. So it's very similar to how a flight is taking off and how it attains the drive to maturity and finally what happens, right? It can be given this analogy just to easily understand. So from a primitive society, you take off. So what is the precondition? There has to be certain condition that is essential. So external demand for raw material initiates and economic change happens. Right? So because of this changes in demand and thought process of people, development of more production, commercial, agricultural and cash crops, the precondition starts to build. Money starts to accumulate. Resources starts to accumulate. Demands change. Demands increase. So what happens? Investment starts. And investment change the physical environment, spread of technology, changes in social structure as well as economic structure. Right? This is what is preconditions before the actual takeoff. Now, when these situations are there, enough investment potentials are created in this particular scenario. The third step that he said was the takeoff stage. And then we have the drive to maturity. And then finally, economy grows into the mass consumption. So what is this takeoff? Now, this takeoff is beginning of manufacturing. When the economy starts to manufacture products rather than depend upon just subsistence produce. Right? So manufacturing hub, when it starts to become, then more investment, more innovation starts to have multiplier effects. Right? So primary sectors in the economy shifts quickly towards secondary, and then gradually there is a rise of service economy as well. So textile and apparels are generally take-off industries if you observe. Right? Then drive to maturity happens, like a flight takes off and after 10 minutes it is now stable, almost motionless that you feel, right? So diversification of industrial base, multiple industries expand, new ones take root quickly. So you have diversification of the economy here in the drive to maturity. So maturity means diversified economy, not just one type of industry, but variety of industry, multi-industry linkages, several agglomeration factors, economic factors, geographical factors coming together to play the role of maturity in economy. Then large scale investment in the infrastructure. Right? This is the next point in drive to maturity. A mature economy has large amount of investments and a huge industrial base is created. Right? Then what happens in the last phase that Rostow has to say is the age of mass consumption. Because after this maturity, people have this spare amount of money. They have spare amount of resources to consume more and more. So you have this peculiar consumption, mass consumption. Remember, primary sector is of great diminished importance now. More importance is given to the secondary and tertiary sector, the service economy. Right? Rise of service economy that we say, the tertiary sector rise, and then widespread and normative consumption of high value goods starts to happen. Right? So just think about it. In a primitive society, somebody would never think of buying a car or a huge automobile or maybe helicopter for that matter. But in age of mass consumption, somebody can even own a huge Rolls Royce or a helicopter because it is now available as well in the city. Right? And now one can have that enough spare money to invest, to buy those high value goods. Right? That is where you have automobile revolution coming in as age of high mass consumption example. So consumers typically, but not universally, what has been mentioned, have disposable income. The factor here is that you have a disposable income. It is not just subsistence, that what you grow, you eat and sleep. It's about having a spare money, a disposable money, that income that you can use it for circulation into various other factors. That is the rise of luxuries that you say. Right? Beyond all your basic need. So if the society rises beyond the basic need of what we say is roti, kapda and makan, right? Then it starts to develop as a age of mass consumption because the requirement is not just basic but beyond basics. Right? So this is the stepwise analysis of what Rostow had to say. So further, if you observe, Knox and Marston, they actually made this model in this particular way to make it more clear in terms of understanding. So let's understand, from traditional society, its characteristic is limited technology and static nature, right? Not much of development. Transition starts by external influence at many times, and also because of rise of market and rise of interest, rise of demand. So what happens? There is a precondition building. Precondition is commercialization, exploitation of resources, agricultural development into extensive forms from intensive, right? And then you have more industries coming in the beginning. That is when preconditions for takeoff is there. And then starts the takeoff phase where you have a development of manufacturing sector, right? Emergence of social and political elite that you say. Right? That's important. And then you have economy rising to maturity, where development of wider industrial commercial bases, diversification happens, right? So what you say, investment in manufacturing sector exceeds even 10% of national income, right? Development of modern social, economic and political institutions, right? That is important. And from drive to maturity, there is a rise of mass consumption pattern in the society, in the economy, that is exploitation of comparative advantages happens at international trade level, right? So what you observe, this is a sequence, a historical development of economic growth through Rostow's model that has been described in this particular way. But remember, there are several criticisms to this model as well. Why there are criticisms? The first important point is that not everything grows organically from a precondition to the modern. There could be different factors that could be responsible for the economic growth of a particular society. How? Let's understand. So the first idea is that traditional society is not prerequisite qualification for development. You need not be underdeveloped to become developed. How we can say that? Remember, the countries like USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all these were not traditional society when they were born, because the traditional people were all driven off by the colonialist. So colonialism factor was ignored here, because development in USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand was not from the soil itself. It was planted growth, which was not talked here in this model. Then stages tend to overlap. Many countries you will find that the stages, right, from the pre-development to the age of mass consumption, in this given sequence does not apply. For example, New Zealand and Denmark experienced takeoff as a result of agricultural innovation and development. They did not have industrialization only. So one step is gone, right? So drive to maturity happened just on the basis of agricultural innovation. That is also here. So we have a failure here in that way, or it is criticized in certain applications. Then drive to maturity is also confusing, because in many contexts, drive to maturity becomes different. So stages contains all the features of takeoff that we know, but net investment over 10% of the national income is not necessarily, right? In many places, you will not find this condition fit. Right? So drive to maturity many times gets confusing, and chronological order that has been mentioned, that first pre-development, then pre-takeoff, then drive to maturity, and then finally mass consumption. This chronological sequence is not maintained in many places. Stage of high mass consumption came before anything else in Canada and Australia, because they got maturity due to the external economies coming there. Isn't it? So that is one thing where you don't apply this theory. So what happens? Where criticism lie in the developed nations, especially which developed through the external economy concept, not from the organic concept. There this theory cannot be applied in most of the developed countries that you say today. But where it can be applied? In those countries which are developing right now from the organic base, from their own resources, not too dependent upon the external economies, but rather they have been primitive society. Then they actually grew. Then further they had maturity, and now they are growing into mass consumption. So if you have that kind of characteristic, that is where in underdeveloped countries of the world or developing countries of the world, this theory can be applied. So concept of takeoff ideally fits the case of developing countries only. Right? So Rostow's idea of over 10% capital formation and development of these propulsive leading sectors are of immense importance for only developing countries. That's why developing countries like India and others, and several African countries as well, if you observe, there you can apply Rostow's model. Because their development in certain areas are not happening because it was planted from outside but by some developing economy or developed economy, but rather it is growing organically from a pre-developmental phase, and now it is started to show the sign of drive to maturity and further the mass consumption in certain pockets as well. Right? So that is very important. And last important point of criticism is that this theory does not talk about the rise of world cities. Those cities which are now in such a way growing that they have over-occupied the imagination of people and they have transcended the country boundaries. Now remember, Delhi NCR, or for that matter New Delhi or Mumbai in India, are world cities. right? Their influence is not just in India but in the world level. So rise of world cities was something that he could not envision in 1960, which happened due to boom of science and technology, internet revolution. So this concept of Rostow's model does not fit in certain areas in the world city concept and certain economies that have been created in today's world. But definitely it is applied to those developing nations where you find these conditions fit, rising from the primitive agriculture base to the modernization today as well, right? So this is important to understand in Rostow's model. So now, when we have analyzed and understood in details this Rostow's model of growth, also its criticism and application, in the sessions to come, we'll be talking on other models and theories in human geography. So stay tuned, keep watching, keep learning, and don't forget to share the videos in your acquaintances, in your circle, and spread the outreach of this channel. So all my best wishes to all of you.